Welcome to the first track session of day 2. I'm really excited. The session's entitled Learning Engagement. What a great introduction we had from Bo, first thing, to set it up for our speakers today. And of course, we all talked yesterday about a lot of ways of getting people to attend training or making training more interactive or applying things like compliance and diversity. But it's very true to say that whatever it is we're trying to give people, it's all around making sure that they want to be there. And quite often people come because they don't necessarily want to be there. So this session is all around how do we actually engage those learners? How do we make it interesting? And is it actually something that's in our power or maybe not? And that's what we'll find out. So for those of you I haven't met, I'm Cathy Morris. I'm the track chair for track 3 today. And we'll be in here for this session and the next one, and then back in room 3 at the end of the day. The speakers we have on engagement are Lucy Standing, who is a chartered occupational psychologist and head of training for the Association of Business Psychologists, and Laura Overton, who I'm sure needs no introduction at all, but is the MD of Towards Maturity. And she's going to be stepping up behind Lucy's more psychological approach with some data, and what does the data actually tell us about engagement. So a really nice balance of speakers there. So we're going to kick off with Lucy, just a little bit more about Lucy. As I said, she's a chartered occupational psychologist. She's also a fellow of the British Psychological Society, and her career started at Morgan Chase, but she's also done strategic consulting, and she now runs a not-for-profit website called New Train, where professional trainers can share material. So you might want to talk to her about that as well, because that's an interesting one. So you're the brains behind it, Lucy. Let's hear what you have to say. Good to give her.
Thank you very much. I'm actually very thrilled to see as many people here on the subject of the psychology of engaged learning. Being a psychologist, it is naturally a subject close to my heart. The things that I'm going to be spending time looking at today is I'm looking very much at this from a learning perspective. I'm not really specialised in looking at this from an e-learning perspective or from classroom training, but just more learning in general. I'm happy to talk more specifically on those other points, perhaps in break times or later on throughout the day. What I want to spend time looking at is what actually influences us, what actually helps to engage people once we've actually got them into a learning episode. Now, I'm sort of following Bo, and unfortunately my slides are not as good as his. He had a video of neurons growing in the brain. Unfortunately, this is my artwork using paper, because I couldn't find a video or anything like that at my disposal. I don't have a lab. But what I wanted to use this for is just to sort of illustrate very much what he was already talking about, how it is that different parts of the brain communicate with each other as our learning develops. Now, psychologists refer to this as the movement from our learning from a stage of declarative knowledge through to proceduralized knowledge. So declarative, if I use the example of riding a bike, when you first start out, you're very clumsy, you're liable to fall over. As you get better, as you do it more often, as you get practiced, you see that the connections start to get made. The cerebellum, which helps to control our muscle coordination, our emotional center, our memory, some problem solving, it all starts to tie together. The more that we do it, the more that that pathway gets trodden. Now, the important thing about that is because once you've learned something, it's then very hard to unlearn it. I can't say to you now, pretend you can't ride a bike anymore. We're so efficient at processing how it is that we learn stuff that it becomes automated. It becomes proceduralized. Now, that has implications for us in terms of how we actually want to engage with people and how we want to get them to learn. It's not going to be very profitable for me to spend time trying to get people to change the way they view things or change their attitude to things. A manager will do things the way he does things because it's comfortable, because it's become proceduralized, because it's become automatic. Cognitive behavioral therapists, if they're going to work with a patient, say, for example, someone who's got agoraphobia, they're not going to waste a huge amount of time saying, right, let's challenge why it is that you think you can't leave the house. What they'll do is they'll spend more time on the behavioral aspect getting them to walk to the end of the drive, to walk to the end of the road. And actually, when you realise that the sky hasn't fallen down on top of you, then maybe that develops a new way of thinking. And we see that happening. This is the Eleanor Mcguire study looking at UK taxi drivers. And this was done in 2010. And it's probably quite hard to see, but the area that's responsible for learning kind of visual spatial maps, so the knowledge test that is associated with people going through to become a London taxi driver. This is a kind of longitudinal study, so year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And as you can see, the area on the left, the little black area, is rather undeveloped in year 1, but by the time you get to year 4, it's very developed. And when I say very developed, I mean, it's all relative. I mean, a brain's the size of a large grapefruit, so even just a small expansion like that is significant. And it was a controlled study, so more than 70 people didn't learn the knowledge, and there was no development of that region of the brain at all. And what this has is very significant implications for the nature versus nurture debate. You know, there's maybe they learn it, or maybe they're good at that job because that's something that they're inherently able to do. They've got a talent to do that better than others. Now, there is an element of truth to that, but practice and time and effort can help to change, literally change the structure of our brain. And this has important implications for people who believe they can't do things. So spending time educating people about what they can actually achieve helps to change their motivation to actually engage in that learning episode in the first place. Now, motivation alone is almost a totally separate subject area, and I will not do it justice if I try and talk about it in this session that I've got now. But motivation is incredibly important. You know, what needs people have, what they perceive to be important to their personal development. Huge elements of their personality, whether or not they're conscientious, whether or not they're an anxious person, slightly more neurotic. There are a lot of elements there that actually, to a degree, we actually have rather little control over. So to a degree, it's right that I spend time now talking about what actually influences people when we've got them, because that's where we have slightly more control. So looking at some of these influencing factors, you've probably, have you all seen this learning pyramid before? Hands up if you have. Okay. All right, so this is actually an incredibly efficient way for me to sort of summarize the main thrust of what it is that I want to talk about today. What it's saying is you can absolutely learn things through reading a book, through hearing what other people are saying, through seeing things. However, those methods of learning are more passive. Okay? Elements of learning that are more active, think of the example of riding a bike where you're using your cerebellum, your problem solving, your emotional center. Yikes, that hurt, I fell over, I'm really going to make sure I learn from that experience. Elements that are more active, elements that involve you doing, are what are more engaging for us because they are literally engaging more parts of our brain. And part of the reason that it becomes more engaging is because we are receiving immediate feedback. Now, I don't just mean feedback in terms of a manager who's saying, look, you know, I didn't quite like the way that you did that. Maybe you could think about how you would redo it. Of course, it does mean that, but it also includes all of the other things that are important as well. So if I'm doing a talk now, I'm getting feedback from your eyes. I'm seeing if your I'm seeing if your eyes are glazing over. I'm also hearing what other people are saying. I can get a sense of the muttering. I can see the amount of coughing in the audience gives an indication as to levels people, oh, thanks a lot. Level of boredom. Thank you very much on cue. So, look, I'm doing it now. Great. So feedback is one of those very important mechanisms that drives engagement. So that has big implications for e-learning packages. It has big implications for trainers. And research that has actually been done on this, if you look at, there's a paper written by a lady called Mary Gelongo in the US, and she's looked very much at kind of classroom-based learning. And the significance of what they've looked at over a 4-year period, students who start off, say on the 50th percentile in terms of their ability to attain certain things in different subjects, end up after a 4-year period at quite a around the 75th percentile for one group versus 40th percentile for another. And that's a difference of 35 percentile points, or the difference from an A to an E. And when they looked at videos of why that happens, and obviously it's a longitudinal study and they're looking as they go through, but the main thing that factors that change is how meaningful teachers are making those experiences for children. And I'll come on to talk about that a little bit later. All right, working memory. This is actually something that's been developed by George Miller back in the 1950s, but it's still true today. Basically, we can cope with a certain amount of information and not much more. So if I was to say to you that we have this sort of magic number 7, I was actually having a conversation with Don about this, and he said, actually, you know what, I think it's probably closer to 5 or 6, because most of the time people have now got a mobile device or something that they're also paying attention to when we are trying to absorb or trying to look at more information. So I think he's probably right. I'd say 5, 6 pieces of information in one learning episode is probably appropriate. When I say a learning episode, I mean probably a 20-minute period. So the length of a classroom lesson, the length of perhaps an e-learning piece of instruction that you're trying to get across. And what they've found is that if you try and develop knowledge around more areas, so if your objective for that lesson or for that episode is to try and get more than 7 or 8 pieces of information across, you will immediately be onto a sticky wicket. You're not going to be able to achieve it. And when you start presenting people with too much information, actually their ability to recall 5 numbers, so your ability to recall the top 5, if I was to ask you to close your eyes and recall them, you'd be able to do it. Your ability to remember even the first 5 of a 9-digit number actually becomes reduced. So you might still be only asked to remember 5 letters or sort of 5 numbers, but because you're presented with too much information, you can't successfully even take on board those first few pieces of information. Now, timing's important as well. I'm very glad to have the morning slot today because you are at your best in the morning. Obviously, there are individual differences, but generally speaking, this is true. You're probably familiar with the Israeli court judges looking at people and deciding whether or not they could go on parole. And the only factor indicating whether or not people would be allowed to go on parole wasn't the seriousness of the crime, wasn't the race of the individual they were talking about. It was literally how soon after that judge had eaten some food and was then being asked to make that decision. So I guess implications for trainers, if you can bribe people to eat a bacon sandwich or something, you'll probably find that people will process information better. Your brain is an incredibly hungry organ. It consumes about 20% of the calories we eat in a day. I think reasonably a lot. I obviously, reasonably slim. I do a lot of thinking. I think the other thing just to say about timing is the average human attention span is around 12 minutes. Now, if you're naturally intrinsically engaged in something, if something you find inherently interesting, that can keep going for a much longer period of time. But generally speaking, we do have to tell people about certain things, whether it's compliance, maybe it's something to do with health and safety. We should be aware of the fact that people can pay attention for around 20 minutes, which is why I'm going to talk for 20 minutes, then we're going to have a natural shift where I move over to Laura. So we're kind of obeying the rules of psychology in the talk as well. So what sort of criteria do we need to think about in terms of what's actually going to transfer into long-term memory? Well, first and foremost, I've got a picture of an iron here because pain is the most effective transmitter for making sure that we actually remember things. Now, bearing in mind, you're probably not at liberty to electrocute the people that you want to have remember things. The 2 things that are really more at a practical point for our disposal, for our use, are firstly, things have to make sense. Okay, if we don't understand something, we can't encode it, we can't process it. Secondly, it has to have meaning. So for example, these 2 sentences both make sense to you. But as learning and development professionals, by the way, these are made up figures. I actually don't know what you guys are paid. Quite like to know, but I actually don't know. But if I was to ask you, if these were true, if I was to ask you in a week, what are learning development professionals paid, you'd be more likely to remember the second one because it's in your field. It has more interest to you. It has more meaning for you. The teachers, for example, who are more able to get more out of their students, were able to create more meaning by getting people to refer to things in their longer-term memory. So instead of saying that A is for apple, B is for banana, C is for cow, the more successful teachers are doing things along the lines of, who here has got some fruit today in their snack box that begins with the letter A? Who here in our class has a name that begins with the letter B? C is for cow. Who's actually seen a cow? Where did you see that cow? Tell us when you saw that cow. So they're actually relating the content to the people that they're talking to. There's a neuroscientist in the US called Jordan Popank who's done a lot of work looking at this. And they showed people in magnetic resonance scanning equipment images of landscapes. Now, when people were seeing images that had more meaning to them, so maybe the shopping mall that they used to go and spend time in, the village that they grew up in, the house that they lived in, then all of a sudden, areas of their brain lit up like a Christmas tree. Because when you are looking at engaging longer-term memories in the learning process, then that naturally has more engagement because it has more meaning to us. And I guess the implication for us is doing what we can to ensure that managers, to ensure that people who are working in social networks, people who are delivering classroom training, people on e-learning courses, are asking people to reflect about and to think about how this relates to their jobs. Now, I have a photo here. This is an example of how we can use emotions to engage people. Somebody came up to me last week and said, "My God, did you see that picture of Christy Brinkley?" And I said, "No, don't really know what you're talking about. I don't really read the tabloids very much. I definitely don't read Daily Mail online." And she said, "Look, you've got to look at this picture." And I looked at it and I thought, wow, she looks amazing. Guess how old she is? 59. Oh my God, she's 59. And that element of shock and surprise is incredibly effective. I'd be willing to bet you will walk around with this image, probably in your head, later on thinking, my God, people at 59 shouldn't look like that. That just raises the bar way too high for most of us. But that element of shock is useful. Other emotions. Humour. Very important. When people laugh, you immediately turn to see what's going on. It's attractive. It is engaging. Now, emotions, I mean, you can almost kind of cheat slightly. I mean, I could ask you to spend 20 minutes playing Angry Birds and you'd enjoy it. You wouldn't necessarily learn anything of any use because it's not being steered by what it is that we're wanting to direct and what we're wanting to steer. So emotions are important. We have to develop emotionally engaging experiences. However, they do have to be based in the context of reality. All right, I can learn to play Angry Birds, but that's not really going to get transferred anywhere else. Oh, look, I've got a picture of a baby here. I'm trying to develop an emotional engagement with some of the slides we've got up here. And what I'm trying to illustrate with this picture is basically the importance of sleep. Now, I have to say I'm not an expert in the area of sleep science. There are a number of people that study this, but what seems to be coming across is more and more evidence to suggest that things get encoded whilst we sleep. So we're listening to the information, but 90% of what we learn in any one given day gets forgotten about in a 24-hour period. And it's because unless it's important to our survival or all those sorts of things that we need to know, then actually we need to have things reinforced. So we should be paying attention to actually not doing learning as a one-off episode, a one-off event, but actually reinforcing it time and time again. Now, these are the results of a meta-analysis. Quite old now, back in 2000. And when I say a meta-analysis, it's taking data from they initially looked at 256 peer-reviewed journal articles that looked very much at what factors influence the success of training, of learning episodes. And they looked at it at all of Kirkpatrick's levels, but I'm actually only just sharing this last one with you because it would take too long to go through all of the others. But if you are interested in looking more specifically at what affects people's ability just to learn the knowledge or what affects people's ability just to learn the skills, then I'm very happy to share that with you. But in terms of transfer, so what actually transfers to the workplace, I'd like to point out this thing at the top. What people know has very little impact in terms of what actually gets transferred to the workplace. People might know they shouldn't do something, but unless they're trained on how else to do it, unless they're practiced on how else to do it another way, they don't feel confident enough to put it in place. And that relates to this sort of thing about self-efficacy. Locus of control, how conscientious people are. We don't have a huge amount of control over these things. Anxiety relates a lot of the time to how enjoyable things are. You know, if we've made something really scary for people, if the climate is rather scary, then the idea of actually trying things out and transferring is incredibly challenging. I'm about to finish, actually. All right, so in summary, I think all I wanted to kind of pull across is the fact that From a practical perspective, we're very good at developing knowledge. We're very good at asking questions about, what that relate to the budget that we have. We're very good at listening about what an organization needs to impart to the people who work with us. And I hear a lot of questions when I'm asked about, can I get involved in helping an organization to deliver some sort of learning intervention? I get a lot of questions about, well, it's got to be delivered in this time scale, at this moment, in this afternoon, at this half an hour slot. So there's a lot of questions around convenience. And yet, what is much more likely to sort of predict successful learning are questions around how are you going to develop these skills? What feedback mechanisms are you going to ensure you have in place? What kind of meaning are you going to create for participants? How are you going to get people emotionally engaged? And how is this all going to fit into how people sleep? And how are we going to do that over a more longer term period of time, as opposed to it just being a one-off episode? So those are more of the questions I'd like to see us asking, and that's certainly the key for making a lot more of our learning interventions stick. And that's me done. Thank you very much.
That's great. Okay, so while we just transition over and swap slides and so on, has anyone got any questions for Lucy?
Don't be shy.
Well, I have. I'm interested in this concept of, that I've got to get the difference between the two of those. But yesterday we heard a lot about the new era needing us to transition from giving people just what we think they need to what they actually need. Which I think is quite a big ask, actually, because it's about how do you actually find out about that. So if we keep ourselves in the position that a lot of L&D professionals find themselves in, without the luxury of actually being able to give people exactly what they need, but a kind of vanilla, or perhaps a little bit tailored, more tailored than that, but a slightly vanilla approach to something, how can we use some of the concepts of psychology to perhaps help people make more of a connection? And I get the fact that, helping them understand what they know and make the connections there. But anything in particular we could be doing that would help us with that?
Well, I guess the reality is we won't ever really know fully the motivations behind why people get engaged in wanting to learn something. And wanting to learn something is important in terms of subsequently driving whether or not people actually learn. If they don't want to be there and if they don't want to engage, then there's not an awful lot we can do about that. And the research, and this is kind of really what I didn't talk about, but the research that looks at what actually drives the motivations around learning is actually not something we have a huge amount of control over. So people's perceived needs. If I'm actually really interested in developing eco-beauty products, I will go and find that training. It won't necessarily be in the organisation that I'm spending time working in at that moment. The other sorts of things that come into factor are very much around personality. So there's a lot of people who believe, that's the self-efficacy piece, around if they can actually go on this course, will I actually be able to put that into practice afterwards? And again, that's quite a personal thing. It's not necessarily something we're privileged enough to know about at the point of us being learning and development professionals dealing with the people that we're looking at. It's got a lot to do with people's personality, whether or not they're conscientious, whether or not they're anxious about it. Some people have had hideous episodes of learning experiences in the past, which they've found boring, which they found uninteresting, which they found intimidating, and a lot of that drives subsequent motivation. So, actually, it's almost an impossible ask.
Yes.
So, I'm sorry, that doesn't really help.
No, I think it is interesting, though, because I think, it's very hard for us to really tap into those very personal things, and motivation itself is a very personal thing. So,
and very important.
I think it's quite easy for us to come away from here very swept up on the concept that we ought to be doing something that actually is going to be quite hard for us to do, because, it's all personal need. People will go and find it if they want it. Yes, we can do that in our businesses and give them work-based things that they might want to do more likely than other things. But the human beast is a complex creature.
Very complicated. We try working
and we're all different. Okay, well, thank you very much, Lucy. That was a really interesting session. Thank you. Right, we are now moving over to Laura. I'm sure Laura, as I said earlier, needs no introduction, but just quickly around towards maturity, they spend a lot of time benchmarking practice that provides research around performance, particularly in businesses, and I know Laura's done a lot of work with the government around this. So we're going to be transitioning into kind of really what's the data behind this, and I think Laura's going to be calling on you a bit to help with that.
Indeed.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much. And Lucy, thank you so much for giving us more of that insight. I mean, I think a word that we've heard an awful lot about is that having that emotional connection. How do we create that emotional connection across the last couple of days? What I want to do is to take something that looks really quite boring about using data, you know, the numbers that you'll all forget anyway, given now we know what it is that we're going to be remembering. And actually start to think about what is it that we know that we can actually start to act on. Because I think one of the big issues for many learning and development people who, across this conference over the last 12 years or so that I've been involved, it's always been the big issue is how do I get my staff engaged with learning in new ways? It's a really, really important thing that's affecting us. And what I'd like to do in the next sort of 20-25 minutes is for us to start to think together about the things we can control rather than the things that we can't control. And what I'd also like us to do is to be willing just before lunch to perhaps rethink what we think about learners. We put them in boxes very often. We say, well, of course, they're the older people, the older workers, they don't like doing that. The younger workers, they always want to do this. You know, we use things like always, don't like, and we label people and put people in boxes. And what I want us to do today is to think outside of that environment in a new way. And really what's really inspired us to do an additional piece of work, which I'm going to come on to in a moment, is the fact that our benchmark, which actually is 10 years old, Learning Technologies, it was launched in 2004, when we've been going out to learning and development people saying, how do you do what you do? How do you bring in learning innovation? What's working, what's not? So everyone who participates in our studies can get a sense of what they're doing and how it compares with each other and also the top learning organisations. But something that comes up time and time again is the fact that the barrier to people engaging of us adopting learning technologies is the fact that our staff are reluctant to be learning online. And this comes up so much that it made us think, I think we need to revisit what do the learners think. And I don't like using the word learner because actually what I mean is what do nurses and doctors, what do project managers and engineers, what do managers versus administration. But there's a lot of names under the word learners. So that's what I'm talking about. What do the people at work actually think about the way they want to learn? And 10 years ago, we were the first to actually do studies into this area. But we've been revisiting it in the last year, and we've had a number of organisations take part in our learning landscape study, which is an anonymous study that goes out to their staff to say, not what do you think about me as a learning and development department or about my learning or what I can do for you, but what is it that you're doing for yourselves when it comes down to finding out what you need to do your job, and gives a broader perspective. And what I would like to do today is to draw on some of that information that we've gathered in from the learners to help challenge through some of our perspectives. And we can see really these are some of the audiences that we've been able to split those 2,000 down by. Now these are all private sector organisations at the moment. They are multinational learners as well. But it's a perspective about a landscape, and that I think we need to start to be thinking about to challenge our own thinking. So how do staff learn what they need to do their job? Well, coming on to your area, the stuff that they do the most is the active stuff. They're in the conversations, they're in the team meetings, their manager, that work context, absolutely vital. Equally, going out to Google, absolutely, these top areas are the top three. But the fourth area is still the course, that safe environment, something that they enjoy doing. However, having said that, 88% of them are saying the course is important, but I need to be able to do more self-paced. That's important to me as well. I don't want to be constrained to that hour when I'm supposed to be learning e-learning or that 2-day course, even though it's gone down from 5 to 2. It's still an issue for people to be able to learn at their own pace. 51% actually say, you know what, the e-learning stuff's working for me, particularly salespeople. If you guys are doing anything with sales, they seem to be connecting much more with learning technologies than, say, for example, with others, including managers as well. Managers are also a lot more open to technology than perhaps we would have thought. So what about the technology? Because, maybe it's the courses or whatever, but actually 75% of learners, and this is consistent regardless of age, are saying, we're willing to engage with online learning without us necessarily being prompted. So there is quite an interest in that. It's being driven by their own circumstances, but something's happening. So there's more willingness than perhaps we would have thought. But you might say to me, yes, but that's fine with the established stuff. But actually, what we want to do now is we want to get our people to share their knowledge with each other. And in fact, 95% of learning development people say that's really important to us moving forward. Only 20% are achieving it. So is the learner perspective actually causing us reluctance and disengagement with that? Well, when we ask people whether or not they're willing to use technology to share with other people, it was only 16% said absolutely not. I haven't got the time, I haven't got the interest. The rest were either already doing it or were saying, you know what, I am really interested in this, but I need a bit of help. Or they were saying, this is something I want to consider if I had the opportunity moving forward. So there's an interest and a hunger there. And it's not just about the sharing, but it's also the fact that they're interested in the technologies that allow them to do that. And yes, possibly the learning, the under 30s, slightly more interested in the technology side, but there was very little variation across the board of the audiences. There weren't reluctant learners, and in fact the managers were actually higher scoring than these than actually some of their younger staff. So again, we need to perhaps be challenging our assumptions, because when we ask the learning and development professionals from our main study, 18%, only 18% said, that our staff have got the ability, they don't know how to do this. So there's, on one hand, a sense from learners coming back to us saying, I'm actually quite interested, help me, let me. And on the other hand, learning and development teams as a whole, 4 out of 5 of us saying, our staff aren't even able to do that. There is possibly a mismatch of what we might need to be able to do. If we can address some of that mismatch in our thinking versus the learners in our organisation, and I know I'm presenting to you something which is a much broader context, it might give us an opportunity to address some of the issues that are in our control. So what is it that the learners themselves are saying holds them back from engaging with online learning? Now, normally when I ask an audience of L&D people, probably about 80% of them, and we did this in the exchange downstairs, said it's time. They haven't got the time, they're too busy, it's time, it's the big, big issue. But time isn't in the learner's perspective at all. A comment that I did want to make, apologies for this, is are our learners reluctant, or are they actually reluctant to engage with what we do? Which I think is quite an important aspect for us to be considering in terms of that gap in our thinking. And the top 3 areas that are, from a learner's perspective, are things like uninspiring content. That's the top area for them to say, if I'm not engaging, that's why. That actually is higher for managers, and it's a lot lower for salespeople, that particular area. So again, if you're thinking about certain audiences in your organisation, their reluctance may change according to where they're coming from. The lack of somewhere appropriate to study is also the second highest barrier for them. But the fact that they can't find what they need, whether or not it's because it's buried within the LMS system, or the fact that they just didn't even know that their organisation did such a thing, is the third biggest reason. Now, all of these things, we can't affect their sleep, we can't affect their personality types, but these are things that we actually can do something about. So if we take the first one about uninspiring content, they are consuming mostly our own content. So from our perspective, from a learning and development perspective, is there anything that we might be doing that's contributing to this concern that learners have got? Well, don't look at the numbers, it's more of the sense of this, but we ourselves, 3 out of 5 of us actually don't think our programs are relevant. So if we're looking to create meaning and we're not actually developing things that we think are meaningful, perhaps there's something that we need to be addressing with that. Only 30% are using things like storytelling, case studies, videos, making it come alive, sort of like, I'm that Christy Brinkley kind of person, that I can relate to that person, or I can relate to someone in my organisation, a war story, a shock story. We're just not doing it. It doesn't cost a lot, and it's been coming up across the conference, I think, moving forward. 45% of us are still using mainly text in our e-learning content, enough said on that. But most of us are bringing some kind of content development in-house. But of those that are, only half of us actually agree that we've got the skills to be able to do this. Now, all of these factors may or may not be contributing to this uninspiring content. But what else about inspiring learners in that environment? Well, when we ask them, who inspires you to get involved with online learning? Only 7% of those 2,000 said anyone to do at all with learning and development. The majority are saying it's the managers, particularly those who are in place only after about 6 months. So what else potentially might inspire people as well as the actual content itself? Well, recognition is also incredibly important to individuals and to learners. So what are we doing about that as learning and development people? Well, actually, only 17% of us, when we're developing a major program, do something to also support the managers to help them support the individuals that are going through that program. So we're not really connecting with the managers in that learning process. And only 23% of us are recognizing achievement of people going through. So what I want to do is I've given you some ideas, and for a couple of minutes now, you've had a lot of input from this conference so far, but if we look at this issue of uninspiring content and being uninspired, what are some of the practical things that we can do when we get back to address this particular issue? And I'd like you to turn to your neighbours and start to draw some insight from both what we've been discussing this morning, but what else you've heard in the conference, to say, how can you inspire your workers better? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to start to draw out some insight and also specifically challenge each other. Well, what action could we actually take? What specific thing can we do? So I'm going to look at the timer. If you'd like to go now and just start to share with each other how perhaps we might be able to inspire our learners better. So go to each other, not to me. Maybe. I'm really sorry to do this, because as soon as you start talking, I'm cutting through, but hopefully you've started some conversations that you want to follow through on, because that's the most important thing with this. What would be very helpful is if you've come up with a practical idea, if you're on Twitter, to tweet that out. If you're not and you're on paper, absolutely fine. But if there's a practical thing that you think could be done differently, write it down, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to consolidate all of the ideas from within the room and to be able to share them back with you, because actually we do know how to do this stuff. What I want to do today is to share with you how many of us aren't doing the common sense things that perhaps we could do that would really make a difference in our organisation. So hopefully that's given you a flavour through that conversation about perhaps some of the things you're able to do. I'm going to take a risk now. How many people have heard from their neighbour a couple of practical, or one or two practical things that they can do differently? Okay. There's a bit of pressure on saying heard from your neighbour there, isn't it? But hey, it's the psychology. Great, thanks. Well, that was the first challenge, really. And again, I'd like us to be able to feed back some of those. If we've got a moment at the end to get some feedback from the room as well. But what about that second barrier, about the lack of appropriate place? It is a challenge for people. But what's interesting, when we talk to learners themselves, they are finding ways around doing that we don't necessarily know about. We find that actually 54% of the learners are really interested in accessing learning on the go. And that rises, funnily enough, more for salespeople, but it also rises for managers as well. But what they're doing is they're finding ways of accessing the kind of resources they need to help them do their job better using the technology that's available in their hands. So 62% of learners are using some kind of mobile phone or tablet to access stuff that helps them learn how to do their job better. 30% of them are using their own devices to be able to deliver that. And when it comes to where are they learning, 50% of them are using those devices at the point where they need them most. Others are doing it on the way into work, on the way home from work. Managers more likely to be doing things at the weekends, granted. But actually, managers overall are really active in using their mobile technology to get what they need to do their job better. So I think it's something that's really interesting. So the learners are kind of getting around that in lots of different ways. But from a learning and development perspective, actually only 2 out of 5 of us are saying, our staff can learn in places that are convenient to them. The way we provide learning isn't necessarily that convenient for them. When it comes down to accessing that thing that you need at that point, a quarter of us are doing things like job aids and linking those into the programs. And yet 90% of us want all of our learning to be transferred back into the workplace. But we're not doing those things that will help us to build that in. We're not encouraging people to use their own devices, and yet they're using them anyway. So they might look different in your organisation, but the important thing about this data is that we find out what it is that's important in your organisation. So again, just another couple of minutes talking to each other. Are there practical things that we can do to actually help people get to what they need, where and when they need it? So let me hand that back to you again, a challenge. It's quick fire now, but you're near lunch, so go for it. The louder it is, the faster lunch will come. So find out from each other. Again, I'm sorry to break up the conversation there, but for me, what's important in this, if we really are genuinely interested in engaging what we believe to be the disengaged learners, then there are small things that we can actually do. And I think one of the things that we concentrate on a lot is when we hear something about mobile learning or social learning, we then say, but that won't work in my organisation. And that's absolutely fine. And it might be that you've disregarded something like mobile in your organisation. But it might be that you can do one thing in this space. You can do one thing about creating some job aids. You can do one thing about helping people to perhaps learn at home where perhaps originally you thought, I'm never going to offer that because we don't want to infringe on their personal lives. The key thing about using this kind of insight from the learners themselves is to help us see that some of the barriers that may possibly be in place possibly could be overcome by small things that we can do that will help people connect and engage. And the last thing I want to kind of share with you is some of the thoughts around communications. The learners, basically, the third most significant barrier is the fact that they just can't find what it is that they need. They're actually quite inspired, but they can't find what it is that they need. Most of them actually know what they need or believe that they know what they need. So it's not a case of, when you're in a job and you're not doing it that well in your time management or whatever it is, you know that you need some extra help or in a particular issue. That's why we use Google so much. That's why we talk to each other. We know that we need help. But we don't necessarily know that the hours of work that this room is putting in to support people, we don't know what you've done. And in fact, in our learning landscape, we regularly get feedback directly from learners saying, I hadn't realised my company does this for me. I didn't know. I'd asked a friend. I'm now going to look into it. We just don't know. And actually only 52% of learners think that their company communicates their learning offering to them well. So from a learning and development perspective, is there anything we're doing that possibly might be able to contribute to that? Well, less than half of us have got a communication strategy. We put all of our effort into our programs, and we have this amazing thing. We're so proud, and no one knows about it because we then don't tell anybody. So the other thing is that we very rarely publicise the successes of individuals. If someone's had a great experience, I'm talking about it on an exchange yesterday, they say, yeah, we've had some great feedback in. I said, have you shared that back out with other people? Again, creating meaning, creating motivation, making it relevant. Oh, no, we haven't done that. So these are some of the things potentially that we'll be able to do. And again, I'd like to kind of ask you to talk to each other. Do you have a communication strategy? Is there something that you've done that's really helped in raising the profile? So again, just another couple of minutes on that communication side of things. And if you've got practical ideas, jot them down, give them to me. I am going to collate them, or on Twitter. So share with each other. You've got the best ideas in this room. I can't contribute to that. Another couple of minutes before we close off. Over to you. I reckon so. I reckon so, at least. Or we could get their feedback. Yeah, if they've got questions, that'd be fine. But their ideas would be great. Okay, thank you for sharing ideas with each other. I think the whole thing, I hate to kind of stop communication, particularly when we're talking about communication. It just doesn't seem right somehow. But I think it's one of the things that we're very good at communicating with each other, but we're not necessarily applying what we know to actually communicate directly with our learners. And I know that one of the things that we said that we would do in this session today is to help you think through a communication plan. And a number of the elements that we've been talking about so far, about who are the stakeholders that will engage with those learners, how do we bring them on board, how do we help them to communicate, that's all a part of a bigger picture of actually developing a communication plan. Just having a plan will be a help. Implementing that plan in just half of the plan will be more than what 50% of most organisations are doing. So there's some little things there. But equally, let me know if you need more help, because we do have a job aid on how to go through and create a communication plan, taking the 8 steps through. So we don't need to run a seminar on that, because you do know how to do it. It is actually common sense. But let me know afterwards if you need that job aid. So we've been running through uninspiring content. What are the things that we can control in that space? We've got some ideas coming through from the room. What can we do about addressing the learners' concerns about the fact they just can't get what they want at the place or where and when they need it? We've also been talking through about communications. Well, there are some things that we can control. And certainly, while we've been doing our main benchmark research, what we found in our research is that those organisations, those top learning companies, are doing more of the things that we've just been talking about. Of all those percentages, they score higher, either 100%, twice as much, or at least 50% higher on all of the stats that I gave you today. So they're proactive in this space. They're also proactive in all of these areas. And on our 10th anniversary, we've kind of summarise what we've learned from the last 10 years to say, what are some of the things that we need to be doing moving forward, going from alignment, the ability to respond faster, redesigning the way that we do formal learning as well as in the workplace. You've all got a copy of this in your conference pack, by the way. But the key thing about this as well is that it's much more of a customer-activated learning strategy, not just learner-centric, but learners being at the heart of driving what it is that you're looking to do. And again, it was picked up, I think, this morning throughout the conference about the fact that we need to be using data, big data, but our understanding of our own learners to shape our thinking rather than conform them into our own environment. To say the top learning companies are doing this, but more importantly, on the blue bars, the engagement they're reporting in their strategy, where it comes down to changes in behaviour, learners putting into place, managers agreeing, everything, they're actually reporting more engagement, more disengaged, less disengaged learners. So there's just some ideas for you in the last kind of 5 minutes. I'm very happy to hand back to you, to Cassie. But the key thing is how do we act? What's the one thing that we can take from our neighbours, from myself, from Lucy, from this conference, that will go back, that will make a difference to the learners? And if you want to download any of this research or find out more, let me know, or come and see me on stand 179 downstairs over lunch. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Kathy.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Lots of food for thought, and I do hope that you got some great ideas from talking to each other, because actually that is one of the best ways of finding things out when you come to these conferences. The speakers give you things to think about, but it's actually you learn from the people that are attending the conference with you and what their world looks like. We really are quite short of time, but what I'd like to do is just open the floor to 1 or 2 questions, because I'm sure after hearing from both Lucy and Laura, you've probably got something that you'd like to ask. Has anyone got a burning question that they'd like to throw out? No? Okay, so let's turn it back to you. Has anyone got something that they've taken away, they've learned from the person they've been talking to, either around inspiring or communicating or making learning more accessible, that's a real takeaway from them that they'd like to share? I'm sure you all put your hands up, so somebody must have something. Oh yeah, sure.
About lighting the brain earlier, and when an individual perhaps comes into, let's say, the learning module for the first time. And I was thinking from our perspective how we can actually help them and give them confidence. So how important is it for them to recognise something once they already know before they then go into the learning? And will that have an effect on their attitude and their openness to take learning on board?
Yeah, definitely. So if the way in which you engage with that as much as possible, the example I gave was a very kind of a practical example from the sense of people literally looking at scenes from when they were younger, scenes that had meaning to them. But I guess in our context, that's really much more around people asking people to reflect on how that relates to things that perhaps they've done in the past, asking them to consider, okay, in what circumstances might you apply what we've just done now in your training, back in the workplace. So getting people to reflect. So as much as possible, we're trying to activate opportunities for people to access their memories, to access things that they've actually done, to make it relevant to them going forward. And yes, that does help to develop self-efficacy, so the confidence around it. Self-efficacy is really developed by a couple of different things. It's developed by feedback. Specifically feedback though that is focused on effort. So if you're rewarding people or if you're encouraging them and if you're sort of seeing results based on what it is that they're actually doing, as opposed to actually kind of complimenting them on what a great brain they've got or how clever they are, because actually what that does is it's actually rather demotivating. And there's a lot of work by that woman who's sort of done a lot of that. It's a woman by the name of Carol Dweck. So yes, I mean, I guess it is a combination of things, but certainly trying to get that access to the meaning, that access to the memories is important. Sorry, does that answer? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Great. Any other quick questions? Okay, well, that remains for me to just thank the speakers again for a really great session.